Tonight's program is part of the Museum of Science's When Science Meets Art series. For over 6 years now, through conversations, films, performances, and exhibits, we've been investigating the work of people who are shattering the boundaries between art, science, and technology. In our new art science gallery right next door, our goal is to shift perspectives about the ways that science and technology are influencing our lives, our culture, our world. We are extremely pleased to be presenting tonight's program in partnership with the Harvard Art Museums. For centuries, relationships between scientists and artists have played a crucial role in advancing human understanding of the surrounding world. This point is beautifully explored in the Harvard Art Museum's current exhibition, Prints and the Pursuit of Knowledge. So to begin the evening, Susan Dackerman, the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Curator of Prints at the Harvard Art Museums, will introduce us to the exhibition and frame the conversation to come. Please join me in welcoming Susan Dackerman.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here at the Museum of Science tonight. And it is a wonderful opportunity for the Harvard Art Museums to collaborate with the Museum of Science in this way that is so well suited to both institutions. This program springs from an exhibition, as Lisa said, that is up at the Harvard Art Museums right now called Prints and the Pursuit of Knowledge. It's an exhibition that examines the role that artists played in the scientific investigations of the 16th century. And what I was interested in examining was the exchanges that happened between artists and scientists, how the skills, the representational skills that artists had contributed to the projects that were under development, and how they influenced the work of the scientists. The early 16th century was a very important time, as I'm sure many of you know, in the history of science. And it was a time where we saw the rise of natural history. And so for the first time, nature was being examined through empirical means. Observation, firsthand experience, eyewitness were all methods that were being put into play and tested in the experience of the natural world. It happened in a variety of ways. Specimens were collected in the field, and artists and scientists traveled to different sites. And I'm going to use this print as a springboard here to introduce some of the ideas of the exhibition. This is a print by the Dutch printmaker Jan Sanredam of a beached whale that beached in 1601 along the coast of the Netherlands. What's most interesting to me about this print is the way that it emblematizes so many of the means of gathering knowledge that were being put into place in the 16th century. So walking on the top of the whale, you see different figures assessing the exterior of the whale. At either end of the whale, there are figures measuring the length of the whale. And a lot of the data that they're gathering, the length of the whale, the width of the whale, the texture of the whale, is described in the inscription around the print. In the lower left foreground of the print, you see the figure of the artist. And his placement in the foreground there is actually, I think, a very significant gesture. in stating or making a claim for the role of artists in the acquisition of knowledge of the natural world. The artist has his back turned to us. He's making a sketch of the whale that you can probably just barely see. And he has signed his name on that sheet of paper. What the artist is doing for us and for viewers in the early 16th century is translating the data gathered by those naturalists and presenting it to us in a form that is visually comprehensible to a non-specialist audience. Now, I've chosen this image to serve as a springboard for the conversation tonight between an artist and a scientist about the artistic representation of scientific knowledge today. And Alexis Rockman, in a conversation earlier today, told me that he's actually working on a painting of a beached whale right now. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about that in the conversation. Right now, I would like to introduce Alexis Rockman, who we're very pleased has come here from New York. He's an artist who's been exhibiting since 1985. And here's a quote from Alexis that I think very well describes his practice. "My artworks are information-rich depictions of how our culture perceives and interacts with plants and animals, and the role culture plays in influencing the direction of natural history." Alexis has had a lifelong interest in nature and has traveled extensively to see it. He's gone to Costa Rica, Brazil, Madagascar, Antarctica, Tasmania. And these places have become, and the nature that populates them have become the subjects of his work. Alexis has worked closely with scientists and naturalists throughout his career, including Stephen Jay Gould, who has written about Alexis's work. And last year, the Smithsonian organized a retrospective of his work entitled A Fable for Tomorrow. And the exhibition is currently being presented at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. One of the works that Alexis is best known for, and that I hope that we discuss tonight, I imagine we will, is called Manifest Destiny. And it depicts the Brooklyn waterfront 3,000 years from now, showing the effects of climate change and the catastrophic sea level rise. And it's a project that he also worked on another number of scientists with. I'd also like to present at this juncture James McCarthy, who will speak after Alexis. James is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Biological Oceanography at Harvard University. And from 1982 to 2002, he was the director of Harvard's University Museum of Comparative Zoology. He holds faculty appointments in the Department of Organismistic. I knew when I wrote that today that I was going to have trouble pronouncing it. And evolutionary biology. On campus, it's just called OEB, which makes everything easier. And the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. His research interests in recent years have focused on regions that are strongly affected by seasonal and interannual variation in climate. He is the author of many scientific papers, and he currently teaches courses on biological oceanography and biogeochemical cycles, marine ecosystems, and global change in human health. For the past 2 decades, McCarthy has worked as an author reviewer and as a co-chair with the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he is currently the chair of the board of the directors for the Union of Concerned Scientists. Now, I'd like to welcome Alexis Podium to the podium, and he will be followed by James McCarthy. Thank you.
Supposed to make this 7 minutes. I'll do my best. Thanks, Susan. I think we need the next image, and I'm not sure, the next presentation. And what's the tech help? In the meantime, First of all, if you haven't seen Susan's show, you got to go see it. It's unbelievable. I walked through it this afternoon, and I was so jumping for joy, not only to see it, but to be involved in it. Thank you. In any way is a thrill beyond my wildest dreams. I'm going to talk a little bit about my history with painting. And for full disclosure, I grew up not thinking I would be a painter, but thinking that I would do something like scientific illustration or work in the film industry somehow. The things I was interested in, there's no way to be an artist. You know what? Can we lower the lights a little bit in the audience? I know that you're taping this, and you probably need some light on me, but just lower the light levels a little bit. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the idea of what can painting do now, and one of the, I was born at the right time, luckily for me, or I don't know what I'd be doing. Travel has been a big part of my career, and the first couple of images I'm going to talk about time travel and two painters that influenced me profoundly. The first is Charles R. Knight, the great paleo illustrator slash artist, reconstructionist of ecologies of extinct ecosystems. He did work at the Field Museum at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, Museum of Natural History, and the La Brea Tar Pit Museum in LA. This is from the Field Museum, and this is an idea of what the beginning of life might have looked like in the 1930s. See if we can get the next image. This is a friskier version of life. This is a very well-known painting. I forgot the name of the dinosaurs, but they're, some sort of bipedal predator. And the idea of reconstructing what life looked like in the past seemed, as a child, a fascinating way to be an artist. So Charles Knight, I remember looking at his paintings at the Museum of Natural History and being riveted by them. Didn't spend much time at the Met, frankly. The next painter slash artist that I want to talk about is Chesley Bonestell, the great utopian painter of the future. And when you see my images, you'll see that there's a sort of conflict between my perception and Chesley Bonestell's perception. We're going to go to the next image to show you something that I'm attracted to. Now, this is a painting of New York that was commissioned by Colliers in the 1940s during the beginning of the Cold War, showing what a nuclear strike would look like on Manhattan. But Chesley Bonestell has also done paintings of what a meteor would do to Manhattan. So the thing that we're talking about here is ideas about time travel. Now, this is armchair travel, so to speak, but nevertheless, it takes a tremendous amount of imagination. And this is a painting that I believe was done to sell the idea of Destination Moon, the great George Pal 1950-49 science fiction movie that is probably one of the more credible versions. Obviously, 2001 is the apotheosis of that in terms of artists, and you can call Kubrick an artist, of course, consulting with experts to make a believable world. And that's kind of what I consider my project on a certain level. Not that I'm a movie director, but if I want to know information, I go to people that, first of all, will return my phone calls, but also people that I've sort of earmarked as someone that I wanted to talk to in terms of their specialty. So those are my two heroes as a child and people that I still look at from time to time. Now, this is a photograph of me in the jungles of Guyana in 1994, and I went through somewhat of a crisis. After starting my career for about 10 years, I realized that I hadn't traveled enough as an artist, and with some friends, Mark Dion, the fantastic artist who's a very close friend of ours, Susan and Helen, who's also in the audience. Mark had been traveling for some years already, and he generously invited me to go along on one of these trips where we went camping in the jungle where Many people had done field work in the past on the Mazaruni River, and this is in the tradition of the naturalist explorer. And what I'm doing is I'm drawing, I believe I'm drawing an ant in that photograph, but it's in the same cycle of drawings. This is a mosquito that bit me. And you can see that not only am I doing diligent work with a magnifying glass, I'm also trying to do something that takes a lot of time because I had a lot of time on my hands. In the middle of the jungle, being really a city kid. Now that's something that you have to understand. I've been urban most of my life. I've traveled a lot, but I kind of have a due date of 10 days to 2 weeks. That's really as much as I can handle. It's taken me a while to realize that. That's my field work expiration date. Now, this is another drawing or a body of work that I've been doing over the years that have been using mud or soil or material. It's ranged from Burgess shale, pulverized slate, to tar from the pits of La Brea, making drawings of ecological players that are either extant or extinct using the material from the site. This is a painting that was commissioned by Natural History Magazine in 1997, where they sent me down to Manaus to look at a forest fragmentation project that I did in relationship to stuff that Tom Lovejoy established. I believe in the early, Jim, is that the early 90s? Yeah. They needed an artist to make an image that will make people care about these issues of forest fragmentation. Now, to be clear, I'd already had a column in the magazine for a number of, I think, months at this point, but it was very exciting. I was far more interested in doing this project than any fine art project that I should have been doing that would have been better for my career at the time. Jim asked me to bring this image, so I'm going to let him talk about this as well. But this is from a specimen study of a bromeliad near Kaieteur Falls in Guyana. This is a key for the next image that was commissioned by the Department of Fisheries. This is a 22-foot painting that's in their lobby in Seattle. And it's called A Recent History of the World, and it's a history lesson of all the things that have been usually overlooked in terms of triumphal successes. These are ecological disasters that have happened at the hands of humanity over the since humans waltzed out of Central Africa. I'm sort of revving up my speed here because I realize I'm really going over my limit. Imagining a bioengineered farm in the future. This is the painting that Susan mentioned called Manifest Destiny that I worked on with, among other people, Jim Hansen at NASA, who's, I think, a real hero should be all of our heroes. He's been telling it like it is for years and suffering the consequences. Melanie Stiasny, someone that Jim knows, who was at the Museum of Natural History at the time, I believe she's still there, who helped me with the fish. It's imagining the ecology of what the East River is going to look like when the sea level rises 82 feet. Here's the key that someone in the audience did last summer, Harry Solis. Thanks for coming, Harry. Here's a detail of some of the material that's in that painting. And you can see next to the lamprey some viruses, SARS, mad cow disease, amongst other things. You can see I have a lot of fun with this stuff. It's frightening. It's my way of negotiating my ambivalence about being a human. This is our national monument in the future with a snakehead swimming around. This is a fantastic illustration, and the illustrator whose name escapes me, I'm a big fan of, but he generously sent me this file. I found his images in National Geographic, and this is really the tradition that an image like this, if you look at the cutaway and the way the space is organized, even though this painting's 24 feet long, it's using these tropes and pictorial strategies from illustrations like this that I find fascinating. And this is another idea about picture making, and you can see it's Russell Knightley Media from Australia, who did this computer illustration. So anyway, this is stuff that I'm fascinated by, that I love, obviously along with art history. Here's Dorothy, my girlfriend, and I before we got on the Endeavour to go to, and this is the first thing we saw when we were in the Drake Passage. All kidding aside, everyone was rescued and everything ended up fine. For those people, they lived. I don't think that their ecotourism venture went much further. This is just a portrait of ice that I took, and you can see someone's hat in the foreground. I'm on a dinghy. Here's a watercolor I made of the ship sinking with the indifferent krill and jellyfish in the foreground. Here's a 35-foot painting I made, which is basically a group portrait of ice that's now in my show at the Wexner Center. Here's a picture of me and Dorothy in Madagascar a couple years ago before we went on this trail that was really, really grueling. That's on the trail, and you can see that I'm holding a Bruchesia old world chameleon that was camouflaged in the leaf litter. Here's some watercolors that I did in relationship to that trip, and you can see the chameleon at the top. Now, this is actually for one of the few magazines that still publishes departures, run by American Express, because they still make money. So Dorothy, who's a writer, and I did a sort of portfolio of images for them about eco-tourism in Madagascar. And you have to find all sorts of ways to fund projects. Here's a painting that I did about that trip, from that trip as well, that's in the U.S. Embassy in Madagascar, showing the deforestation and some of the key players. And again, this is charismatic fauna, a red-ruffed lemur, a helmet vanga, and a panther chameleon. Here's a painting that I just finished a couple of, well, actually 2 months ago, that's in New Orleans right now about invasive species on the left and endemic species on the right. It's called Battle Royale, and it's basically what's happening all over the world as invaders from other parts of the world come into ecosystems, and here's the key for that in case you're interested. Come into these new ecosystems, and of course this has been going on for thousands of years, and in terms of America, you know, the big shift was in 1500 when you know, Europeans first came en masse. So that's the end of my little presentation, and I'll hand it over to Jim. Sorry, I'm sure I went over. Sorry about that. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Alexis.
No, I want to go. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. Whoops. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here and to interact with Susan and Alexis for this show. I, as you've heard, am an oceanographer. I was educated first as a biologist, then learned the science of the ocean. But from the time I was an undergraduate, I was really quite moved by an experience I had. I spent a year in Europe as an undergraduate, and much of that year was taking courses in art history. And I must admit I've not yet seen Susan's exhibit. I've seen the catalog, and I'm really looking forward to it. There's no excuse for not seeing that one. If we can't get to the Wexner in time, do look at the book that I'm holding here, which is Alexis's show, A Fable for Tomorrow. Many of the images we've just seen are in that book. It's a stunning collection, and I'll make a few remarks about a couple of those. So I firmly believe that that science can be informed by art. I think that art can stimulate science, and increasingly, I think we need art to communicate science. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about Alexis's work, some examples you've just seen, is that I think it does so in a powerful way. And I'm quite serious when I say that I think scientists need art to communicate science, because frankly, we've been trying to communicate science by ourselves, and we're doing terribly. So I'd like to show a couple of images that I think have affected many of us. I know they affected me, and I think they would have affected me were I not a scientist. And I'm going to back up from this one, which happened to just pop up first. But the first image that I want to show is this. And I think you've probably all seen a version of this. It's been widely reproduced. It was taken with a handheld camera by William Anders on Apollo 8. It was on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968. And this was the first time the Apollo spacecraft orbited the moon, returned to Earth. They didn't land that, but it was the first time that they orbited the moon. So it was the first time that a photograph could be taken showing the surface of the moon, and this photo is titled Earthrise. I can vividly recall the first time I saw that image. And it was in one of those big magazines we used to get, Life or Look, or one of those big weekly magazines full of incredible photographs. And I was just awestruck. I can remember talking with my major professor at the time about how you could see that NASA had to be really careful about the people that they put on these flights, because if they put someone like him or someone like me, we would have looked at this and just been babbling idiots and incapable of doing any of the work that we were supposed to do. So I think the other thing that stays with us from this image is the quote that is attributed to the photographer William Anders, which says, "We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing we discovered was Earth." And people have written a lot about these images, arguing that they did impress us in a way that no earlier image had about the fragile nature of this planet. There's another that's widely photographed. There's only one that was taken in that series of Apollo missions, one photograph where they were able to see the entire Earth in an image. It's one that near the time of the summer solstice, and you can see the full extent of the Antarctic ice cap and sea ice. So while this image had, I think, a powerful effect on many of us in seeing how truly unique this planet is, and of course, as we've gone on to learn more about the other planets in our solar system, since this time we've gone on to learn a lot more about other galaxies and other places where life could exist. We, of course, realize ever more how special this one is. The second image I want to show just briefly, and then go to an earlier version of this, is another image that's been sort of widely produced in a variety of forms over the last few years, known as, Earth is at Night. It's a photograph, or rather today they aren't photographs. This would be done with satellite imagery, which would show the presence of light on the surface of the Earth. So you can see the outlines of the continents, the Americas in the west, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And of course, what this is showing us is where humans are densely gathered and in our various activities creating light for our earthly purposes, which can be seen from space. But what I'd like to do now is just go back to the first image of this sort, which was put together with photographs from the Skylab era. And when this was first put together as a composite with a title like that, Earth at Night, it had a similar effect on many of us. So you can see, looking at the left, you can see Florida jutting down. Look at that blur moving up on the right side of the Americas. You see just a blur of what you might call Boswash. It's just one huge metropolis from Boston all the way to Washington. And of course, if you look to South America, you look to Africa, some of the light you will see here is not artificial light, but it's actually burning. It's actually fires. And in fact, there's another blaze of beautiful natural light in the center of this image, right at the top, the streak, and this is the aurora borealis. Over in the far right side, you see a crescent. This is Japan, but it's larger than Japan, because if you've ever flown over Japan at night, the lights of the fishing fleet surrounding Japan are enough to create this sort of image from space. So you have here two fascinating and contrasting images. Contrasting in a sense that this one shows kind of what we do as individuals, and how actions that are taken by every single one of us every day are visible in an image like this. The earlier image shows, of course, or it inspires, I think, that sense of collective stewardship of the planet, realizing that these individual actions are indeed, in their aggregate, affecting the overall planet. So I would like, if time permits later, to come back and talk about this image, which I found to be absolutely breathtaking. And I'll say more about this later if we have time in discussion. But I'd like to skip then to just a final image, which Alexis also showed. As he said, this is Mount Rushmore. I could stand here all day and show you table after table, model projection after model projection, graph after graph for what we know to have happened in the distant past, the recent past with regard to sea level rise, and what we think is likely to happen over the next few decades, over the next century, maybe the next couple of centuries. And your eyes would glaze over. This image I found just gripping, absolutely gripping. Now, you could imagine this having occurred in the distant past, because if you know how climate changed in the past, continents weren't always where they were. There was this big seaway down the middle of what we call North America today. It is that area under which today people are poking holes in the ground, extracting oil and gas, because of course the oil that we burn comes from marine sediments. So at one time that was a big inland waterway. However, there were no faces carved on Mount Rushmore at that time. And if you just think about this image a bit, and what you have in the foreground are mangrove roots. You've got a fish that doesn't belong here at all. The notion that the oceans are rising in a way that will enormously interfere with anything and everything we do in our coastal domain, and in fact reach far inland, I think is conveyed with an image like this, the way no table, no graph, no hour-long lecture on thermal expansion of the ocean or what's happening to ice can possibly do. So I will conclude at this point, and then if time permits in discussion, come back to talk about this, this extraordinary image of the bromeliad. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to proceed to have a conversation and then open up the conversation to you to ask questions. But perhaps we can just begin with something very general. I mean, you both showed great examples of images communicating scientific knowledge. And I think talking about images as vehicles for the communication of those ideas is probably a good place to start. So, Alexis, would you like to have a more specific question than that?
That might possibly. Well, one of the things I was thinking about while looking at Jim's images was that when I start a project, there are certain things that I end up going near and glance off of. And the reason I glance off of them is that they're so effective already as images. I think you chose, the Earth from afar and the electric lights and so on. Those are perfect for exactly what I'm thinking about. Those images are so successful that you can't go near them. So I think one of the things I've sort of developed over the years is this sense of, it's a type of activism and the use of metaphor, but it's also using the authority of scientific pictorialism to walk a fine line between fact and fiction. And I think painting is a great place to do that. I think Photoshop is not. And I consider illustrations still illustrations, even if they're done in Photoshop. That's a whole different craft, but I think there's something about making it physically that gives it a sense of authority that I'm fascinated by. So, but I consider what I do as somewhat of a hybrid of many things.
So that's a great, great segue. One of the contrasts that I would make between these two images that I selected from Alexis's book is this one is, I don't know, 99% fact.
Well, for full disclosure, for if there's any botanists in the audience, I really wasn't that careful about this image.
Well, that's why I didn't say 100. I was being generous, but it's not 100.
I'll tell you the story of how it was made. I saw these enormous bromeliads, and there was no record of them in the literature that I could find. This was 1994, so I reverted to reference that was available. Mm-hmm. So anyway,
and this waterfall is in Guyana, but But those two poison dart frogs are probably from Costa Rica. So
yes.
So you know, but I'm giving it. So this is a fantastic image. I could talk for 2 hours about the biology you see in this image, and if you had the patience, we could maybe do a whole semester-long course on it. That other image is fiction.
Yes, so far.
So far, it's science fiction.
Yes,
and a lot of science fiction is
in
futuristic.
the Wellesian sense.
Yeah, and so the thing that strikes me about an image like this is that this particularly this cutaway. Would allow you to describe all these organisms in this ecosystem with really amazing biology. These poison dart frogs are called poison dart frogs because they have extremely high toxicity in their skin. The most extreme forms, the toxin, they're an alkaloid toxin in one frog is enough to kill 10 people. So great to put on the tip of your poison dart, right? So there are all sorts of fascinating biology about these frogs. Well, let me now skip to the other image. What you can do there, and the reason I said that it kind of took my breath away, is a scientist can't do that. If I showed you all those graphs, all those tables, everything that models will tell us for what climate could be doing in the foreseeable future, the lifetimes of our children, grandchildren, I would do that in the most conservative way I can. I would underplay everything. I would show you the range of models, and I would pick something that is perhaps in the middle of that, or might even downplay it a bit. And why is that? It's because if a scientist were to overstate, and not intentionally, but say, well, I think this is what's happening, and 10 years later, it wouldn't materialize, that person's reputation as someone who overreads the data, exaggerates the interpretation, really casts a doubt on anything and everything that they say from this point on. It will affect their ability to get papers published in scientific journals. People will look at their data and just wonder, did they maybe overread this? It will affect their ability to get grant funding because their peers will say, well, remember they exaggerated something before. I'm not quite comfortable with this person. It affects your ability to teach effectively. So you can do that. You can paint something like this, and I picked a particularly extreme one, but it is a great way to convey a message through art that the scientists can't do without putting your reputation at risk.
Right, and science is opposed to that type of, slightly hyperbolic strategy. So, yeah.
And you mentioned Jim Hansen earlier. Well, here's someone who, of course, as you mentioned, he's paid the price. Interestingly, he's been amazingly precise and accurate. He has made forecasts. He made forecasts in 1991 about how much Mount Pinatubo would cool the Earth's climate over the next couple of years, and he was smack on. He's made forecasts about what the climate would do if CO2 were to rise a certain level. He's been smack on. And there were people who thought he was being hyperbolic because few people were confident enough of their reputations and their ability to speak candidly about what they were seeing to do what Jim Hansen did.
And the Bush administration was diametrically opposed to
Well, but Jim
anything.
Hansen was making statements like this in the 1980s, 88, 89,
Yeah.
90, and he got into serious trouble and paid the price in the Bush administration when they attempted to quiet him.
Yeah.
That's what you were referring to.
Yes. Yes.
Did we answer your question?
Can you imagine then, Jim, working with an artist to supplement your message?
Of course, and the people that Alexis works with. I mean, Tom Lovejoy is a good friend, and I know his work very well. And read his essay in the catalog here. I mean, he was clearly very moved by the ability of Alexis to convey this message. And I would think any scientist who, like Tom, like myself, like Jim Hansen, who sees things changing and is worried about how to convey them effectively would be wildly enthusiastic about working with artists like Alexis. And I'm not surprised, as you were mentioning names of people you've worked with, that you would have had no difficulty engaging.
I feel like I've been really lucky that, you know, more or less been able to work with most of the people I've wanted to work with.
They return your phone calls.
Eventually. Yeah. I'm persistent, though.
Jim, can you actually imagine including something like the Mount Rushmore painting in a class lecture on climate change and rise of ocean levels alongside the graphs?
Yeah, and I could imagine, I mean, I think this, I just picked that as one particular example, the manifest destiny, you know, and again, like this picture, even though it's futuristic, there's an enormous amount of content there that you could tell stories from, and I think those stories are powerful metaphors for what we understand now, for what we understand about how things are changing and what the implications are for the future. I believe that strongly.
Alexis, why don't you tell us about a working relationship with a scientist in the production of some of your paintings and drawings?
Wow, there's so many. I mean, well, first of all, I want to be really clear. That's half of my career is to work with scientists and try to get all the facts completely correctly. And there's another side of what I do that is about going over that edge where I'm not interested whatsoever in science and could care less. And it's pure, I don't know what genre it would be, but it's not about that. So I want to be clear about that. So if you look at the book, it's not all about that. I think because I grew up in a context where my mother was an archaeologist and I grew up around science, I always have that in the back of my mind somehow, no matter how hard I try to get away from it. But I think Manifest Destiny is a perfect example because I spent 8 years on it off and on. And it took about 10 months to paint it, but it took much longer to research it. So the first thing I did was make a list of scientists that I thought would be interesting to talk to, Jim Hansen being one of them, and did interviews with people, 20 different scientists. Being in New York is helpful because a lot of them go through there. And I decided that I wanted a viewpoint that was, just like me, more difficult than it needs to be, unphotographable. So I defined someone who could build Brooklyn in a computer. And this was around 2002 when I didn't even have a computer yet. There wasn't, the software didn't exist where it was that easy to do. So I hired an architect to build the vista that I wanted from the point of view that I wanted, and then started talking to not only Jim Hansen about what was possible in terms of sea level, but ecologists that could tell me the salinity of the water, other people that could tell me the botanical information, epidemiologists, so on and so forth. So I ended up talking to maybe about 50 people and really using about maybe 10 to 15 people like as real reference, including Melanie Stiasny, who's an ichthyologist who helped me with the fish. And then I realized that not only did I need Brooklyn from a point of view that I needed, which was impossible from the level of the East River looking east, with the Manhattan Bridge in view and the Brooklyn Bridge in view, I realized I had to sort of retrofit it as a futuristic ruin. So I had to hire another architect to build the developments that I would turn into ruins subsequently as they failed, like this, the dams and the dikes and the seawalls and all this other stuff, and try to treat it like an archaeological site of the future. So that was really a ton of work. It's tiring just describing it.
If I could turn to a sort of another point of which I've had some strong views, and I saw they're reflected about limitations, so reflected in the writing in Alexis's book. I've been in the high Arctic and the Antarctic a number of times, and it used to be so frustrating to come back from a trip with all my rolls of film processed, and I look at them and none of them were any good. And even when I was with really good photographers, I would look at their great photographs and I say, well, that's not quite what I saw. And so you have this very interesting situation where the light is at a very low angle, and so it's passing through a longer column of the atmosphere. It's one of the reasons that, as the sun rises or it sets, the amount of the sun's energy that actually reaches you at any point is less, because you're passing through a long slice of the atmosphere. Up here it's thin, and as you go down, the angle is greater. And so you have this low angle light, these very, very interesting hues, shadows, contrasts, and of course with ice and water and sky. And film just wasn't designed for that. It just wasn't designed for that. Designed for white light and, between, 50 north and 50 south. And so I used to say, the only way I could, and here thinking about teaching again, could convey effectively my sense of what I really saw in those settings was the work of an artist on oil or watercolors. You could, through the eyes of those artists, see the generation of a product that was real. And as far as I'm concerned, the photographs were unreal. And I was struck in reading that, your experience in the Antarctic, as you commented in the text in the book on what it was like to actually see.
It was like being on another planet. And, I don't pick on photography because a lot of painting hasn't been able to do it particularly well either. I think the only exception is Church's studies on cigar boxes, tops, that really work. Like that's what it looks like. I don't know if I did any better, but I think that that's something, that's like one of those things that you have to find jobs for painting to do, and that are interesting and kind of unique. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is, I come from a position of hippie, commie parents who, very liberal, and I looked at all the civil rights and gay rights and all those traditions, activist traditions, as role models, various levels of success, of course. And I see that the ecological movement has been just a pathetic disaster. The people that have come forward, there hasn't been anyone that's been, charismatic enough and savvy enough and, generous enough, because let's face it, it's a thankless task. I don't want to pick on just I think it's a very tough thing to try to embrace at this point. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was the idea of making paintings in that tradition is something that I've been interested in, that obviously science they need to be level-headed. That's not me. They need to be able to reproduce results. That's what science is, as you know, and be able to prove it. So I've tried to use the information that I believe to be true, and there's so many things I painted that have subsequently been, you know, wrong, or I've been wrong, and it drives me crazy. But you do the best that you can under those circumstances, and that's kind of a painting, a job for painting. And from my perspective, there's a niche.
That's why I said we need you.
There's a lot of great image makers out there, but you know.
So that your painting of South, that's how large again?
30, well, it's 50 times 7, 50 inches times 7. So whoever's good at math.
350.
Yeah, divided by 12. Yeah.
Okay, so roughly 30 feet. So this again, not just the what I was referring to earlier in terms of what an artist can do with color, that is true, but the majesty of this thing. I'm dying to see it. We've got to go to Columbus and see this thing. And when I saw it, it's owned by someone who lives in Boston.
Yeah.
It could end up being here at some point. But just to the scale of that is absolutely fitting to the topic, and looking at this little photograph is very frustrating.
Yeah.
I want to see the whole.
It's also
thing.
very physical, like it's very thick and, you know, very physically
like ice.
made. Exactly.
And as you point out, I mean, the colors.
Frozen
the colors,
geology.
Yeah, the colors that come through ice are just beyond description.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So if you guys can travel to the poles, do it while it's still there.
But go to Columbus for sure.
Go to Columbus. If you're passing through, go. Next question.
Do you think of your work as art and science?
No, not at all. I'm an artist. I use scientific information as content. I've done scientific illustrations, and that's a different job. That's a different hat. And no. I like flirting with things that seem dangerous, and I think illustration can be, you know, kind of taboo subject, which excites me.
Jim, what do you think? Do you think it's art and science if you could teach a semester-long class on, say, the biology represented here?
Well, again, part of the reason that this is so powerful is if you were walking through the forest, you wouldn't see anything except the exterior of the system. And you could peel the leaves apart, and you could maybe see a couple of the poison dart frogs.
A skittering worm.
Yeah, the slug crawling up the side.
Yeah.
But the notion, and bromeliads are they're quite a diverse group, and the most common form of bromeliad is we would all know is the pineapple. Okay, you can see down in the center here something. Imagine, well, another plant could be a little different than that. And that's what I'd eat. So the notion that you've really done it's like your anatomical cross section, and you've got this incredible ecosystem. These poison dart frogs don't make the poisons. They process alkaloids from the ants and the termites and the beetles that would be attracted to the water that collects in these cups formed by the leaves, and from that they produce a couple of hundred of these amazing compounds, and so you can't, as you realize that the only way you could really convey all these relationships is to have an image like this. No photograph is ever going to give you this, because you go around and around and around. You can photograph everything. It's like the CAT scan,
right,
that you have of this.
The miraculous view, yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean you have to admire it as a powerful piece of art, but it is very effective for communicating the science.
And so many of the images in your show are the great-great-grandfather of images like this, and it's a long tradition.
It is. Maybe we should break here and take questions from the audience. They're going to bring
up
you
here, so we'll come to you if you have a question. Can you just give us 1 second to get down there?
Alexis, I'd like to know where in your process you come up with titles for your paintings. And particularly, is there a story about how Manifest Destiny got named Manifest Destiny?
Isn't that the long tradition of American history? I mean, it seems like there's no other title possible. Don't you think?
And it just came to you like that.
I have to say that I wish I read more. You know, the allure of media is a sad and powerful thing. My girlfriend is very well read and teases me occasionally, but she's been confounded by what she considers to be my gift for titles. So I don't know. When in doubt, shuffle through the internet and you'll find something within 5 minutes.
Do you have the title first?
It really depends. It could be. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. It'll take 2 seconds. I was asked to do a self-portrait for a show. And I said, oh, that would be great. I'd be happy to. So I thought about it, and I'm like, I don't want to do a self-portrait. I want to paint a frog, which is usually the case. So I painted the most deformed, disturbing-looking, beautiful frog I could possibly make. And they were very disappointed and kind of angry. And
Had they paid you?
No, it was, in many ways they paid me. Now, of course, I can't remember the name of the title that I came up with because they said you have to have self-portrait in the title. They're very literal. So because they're important to me, I'm happy to please them. But I'll tell you the title. Hopefully I'll remember by the end of this discussion, but that took about 5 minutes.
The next question is over here.
Okay.
I recall maybe 25 years ago, the Geraldine Dodge Foundation was paying for artists to go into the rainforest, and feeling that this was the way to communicate with new audiences about environmental issues. And I know there were programs where artists were sent to Antarctica by federal money, I believe. But are there artists? Are there foundations now that are helping underwrite artists to do this kind of communication?
You're talking to me? I don't know of any, and I don't have any contact with them. I'll tell you something. I tend to shy away from institutional gifts because there's often strings attached, and I'm just kind of too self-involved to really get involved with that. So if someone gave me a ticket, I mean, the Antarctica trip was a gift from Sven Lindblad, who I met socially. But I'd rather pay for it myself so I can just do what I want. But you find ways to cobble things together. But I've never been that attracted to sort of like, support, unless it was ideal where they wouldn't try to meddle.
Jim, do you know of any programs like that now?
Well, the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs, as far as I know, is still continuing the Artist in Residence program in Antarctica. And it's an annual competition, and I don't know what the number is, but a small number, a few, couple, 3, 4, I don't know. Yeah. And they're artists of various forms, authors, painters, have had those opportunities. So go down and spend a field season, and we have actually we know several of them, and of course, if I'm very interested in books about Antarctica, and I've I think read all the books that those artists have written, and we have artwork that has been produced by a number of the painters and in fact one photographer who have gone. So, but that's the only one I know of that is really specifically tied to an exposure to the science. That you know, the artists aren't required to do something related to science, but you're surrounded by scientists. You have a resource if you wanted to paint some of the, I mean, like your marine pictures, where if you wanted the sort of resource that you have with Melanie to enable you to, so what does this fish look like, or how would what would be the proper environment? So, but that's the only one I know of.
Jim, did you ever have artists coming to the Museum of Comparative Zoology to look at the specimens to
All the time.
incorporate
Oh, I went there.
into?
All the time, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great museums.
yeah.
I wondered whether that was one of your
Not really. I mean,
resource
Boston is
research.
far, and I could go to the Museum of
Right,
Natural
the Museum of
History.
Natural History,
Yeah.
but so it is a common practice among
Yeah.
artists.
And you see them if you just walk through the galleries. I mean, they're often art classes working with the exhibits that are on display, but behind, in the research collections, artists would often ask for access to specimens to draw.
So I have the next question in the middle right here.
I think that the difference between medical illustration and what we've been talking about, or illustration, not medical illustration, is that you're trying to tell a story. And so Jim has mentioned several times that he could talk for 2 hours or a whole day or a whole semester about one of these pictures. And it's because there's so many parts to it. And I'm just curious what the role of a story is when you start making one of these things from your point of view, Alexis, and Jim, from your point of view, how you think we can train scientists to maybe make their own illustrations better, maybe by working with artists or by working on their own, but having in mind a story that they want to tell or a point that they want to get across, sort of like what a curator would tell you. When I did go to the print exhibit, it's lovely, and I went with the curator who told me all about it. And that was so much more valuable than if I just stared at the elements of the picture, if I understood what they were supposed to mean as a story.
So the question is story. You know, I don't really think about it like that. And I think about the iconography of the things that are in it, but also the historical baggage or cultural baggage that come along with it. And that's really that's what I'm thinking about. It's not like this linear thing. I'm not interested in that. They're kind of incoherent. If you really think about it. I mean, it's thought through on some levels and it's kind of dysfunctional on others. I mean, it's very eccentric.
But because of all of the details and narrative elements embedded in it, you realize the viewer ends up trying to tell themselves a story about what
I guess on a certain level,
presented.
I'm trying to provoke that response, but I'm not really interested in taking responsibility for it on some level. I mean, now it's not like I'm thinking about it in terms of that seems too sanctimonious to me. There's much more devilish, snickering. You know what I mean? It's kind of, there's a, I don't know where humor falls into the, you know what I mean?
Do you think of your pictures as humorous?
I mean, the joke's on us, right? Yeah, I mean, I often imagine, yeah, I mean, I think they're hilarious.
We have the next question here at the top of the...
Hi, I'd just like to mention that I think Alexander Agassiz has some magnificent watercolors that he made. I'm sure they're at Harvard someplace. I'm not sure they're on display. But I was just thinking that his inspiration was always the thing he was looking at. I wonder what your inspiration is, Alexis.
So many things. I mean, look, I mean, where do you begin?
Where does it all come from to begin with?
That's such a general, I mean, so many places that I couldn't even know where to begin.
But at some point, you must be in a focus.
I mean, the print that Susan showed, I'm familiar with, and I've had this idea of doing, a beached whale painting for years. I tried to do one in the 80s. It sucked. I luckily didn't throw it away, but I would never show it, or would show it as something like a failed something. You know, I started working on an idea about that about a year and a half ago. It never went anywhere. I saw a dead seal in Antarctica last week, 2 weekends ago. That started me thinking, you know, I haven't figured it out. I don't know what it's going to look like. First it was a sperm whale, then it needs to be a right whale, then it's back to a sperm whale. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, you see, it's like this weird, I'm working on this biotech farm painting, and I've been thinking about, you know, I need poultry, and I was thinking about turkeys over the summer, and now it's Thanksgiving, and turkeys make sense, and, you know, how many legs? See what I mean?
You know, you're nearly perfectly describing the divide between art and science.
How many legs?
How many legs?
Right.
Odd or even? Where does symmetry fit into this? I mean, obviously, if it's asymmetrical, it looks like a monster, and if it's symmetrical, it looks deliberate. Those are decisions I'm constantly making, and if I'm making one of the so-called fantasy paintings, it has to have odd legs. If it's a credible science painting, it has to look deliberate. And those are just, you know, common sense.
Devilishly so.
So the next one's up here in the front.
Likely come pretty close to answering. I was interested in how many projects you have going at any one time, and would you say they cross-fertilize each other?
Oh, they constantly cross-fertilize each other, but, you know, I like keeping my food separate on the plate, so. But yes, they do, but it depends on the, I mean, I have I have many projects going in different things, sure, many. But I tend to do one at a time, really. I get them up on the runway, and then I line them up, and I sort of caress them, and then, but I have to focus on one for takeoff.
Perhaps for how long would you be focused on one?
Really, I mean, it could be 6 months at the most, 8 months. But I try to do a couple of things in there, or else I really get crazier.
Next question here in the middle.
Yes, this is for Professor McCarthy. Following up on the mention of Alexander Agassiz, many of, I guess, the great naturalists in the past, I think of Lewis and Clark and Darwin and those others, actually did beautiful illustrations, things that become, artwork in their own right, which initially weren't meant to be artistic. They were meant to be just pure illustration. I'm curious today, as people come into the biological professions and the studies, to what extent is, I guess, visual, artistic image-making skill a consideration, I guess, in people coming into, say, into the biological sciences? Is that something that's even considered at all, or is that something that's sort of farmed out to image makers?
Well, I wish I could give you an uplifting response to that. First, you're absolutely correct about natural historians, Darwin, Humboldt, Louis and Alexander Agassiz. And I was thinking, I was talking about how art is used today in science, that in courses I teach where I'm introducing the plankton and the varied forms of plant and animal plankton, I don't use photographs. I use, most of them are from the 30s, Sir Alister Hardy's watercolors and pen and ink drawings, and you had images in your book that reminded me so much of many of those. No, not SpongeBob. So I think they, as you point out, I mean, these weren't designed to be objects of art. And of course, just up the river where I reside, a great example of that is the biggest tourist attraction in Harvard, the glass flowers. Those were not commissioned as works of art. They were commissioned as anatomically correct representations of plants and their fruits to be used in teaching botany. So they were done with great care, with artistry that is really truly awesome. And you look at those today, and they take your breath away. We see them, I think most people who would visit the museum today would see them as works of art and not realize that the time they were commissioned, this was an absolutely terrific way to teach plant anatomy for plants that people sitting in 021 through 8 would never have a chance to see. Today, of course, access to materials like that is literally a snap of the fingers, and it's here overnight. So to get to the real crux of your question, first of all, in that department I'm in, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Department.
So embarrassing.
Yeah, well, our department spent a lot of time in faculty meetings last year, all year, deciding whether or not to change our name. In part because a lot of people have trouble with that word. And when kids tell their parents they're majoring in, they say, in what? In truth, the name of the department I'm in should be biology, because it is truly that broad. If you look throughout much of what you would find in the way of education programs today, training people to enter the field of biology, I say this with pain, a very, very small fraction of them are anywhere near the subject matter we're talking about tonight. Most of them are dealing with cellular or subcellular components, and that's where the big waves and the fads are today in the life sciences. I would say that a large fraction of the students who would be more inclined to study natural history, who would be in this Organismic and Evolutionary Biology department, many of them are, or do, I think, just by their nature, have artistic talents. I think that, and they may be other places too, and I just don't see them, but I think they, from the earliest time, I mean, I can remember when I was about 10 and my father bought me a microscope, and I went out to get my first sample of pond water and put it in a tube and tied a string to it and whirled it around my head to draw into that tube enough material that I could take a bit out and see things under the microscope. I started drawing things. I mean, I think that certainly before the camera, this was the way that naturalists recorded their observations. So I think that interest in natural history did allow some people from my generation and some people entering the field today to develop artistic skills. But Susan, you could answer this question better than perhaps certainly better than me. I think scientific illustration today is a dying art, certainly as a profession, because 30 years ago, all of my colleagues working in paleontology or in anatomy would hire someone to come and draw specimens that today are being photographed.
Right. And so much now could be modeled on the computer as well. And so I think that kind of drawing.
That is a type of illustration. I mean, that is
Yeah.
illustration.
Yeah.
So the thing that I showed you, the virus, Russell Knightley Media, .com.uk, he has a business in Australia where I rifled through his images and just picked them off, JPEGs off, and used them as reference. So, but they're just not on paper.
Yeah. In the 16th century, naturalists made drawings that were then redrawn or translated to matrices for printing. And one of the most common complaints among the naturalists was, of course, that then the artists embellished these images and took all kinds of liberties and the blandishments took away the actual naturalism of the depictions. So
there's another question over here. So you mentioned earlier that you saw weakness in the environmental movement in terms of activism compared to other social movements. Do you see, or how do you see either of you artists as connectors or inspirers, and what can their role be to incite more activism in this area?
I don't know. I don't think that's really going to be much good, frankly. You need a charismatic leader that's going to be able to mobilize many, many people. I don't think art is not really taken that seriously in America unless it's, you know, auction time. So in terms of its image making, I don't think it really has much power. I think images have power, but I think there needs to be someone who comes forward who is able to articulate and make these ideas that are inherently unsexy and unlovable, lovable.
I think you're underestimating the power of imagery, though, and how it's been deployed historically in different.
I think photojournalism is very good, but I still haven't seen an image that, I mean, what's that, the river in Ohio, the Cleveland River on fire? I mean, there's a couple of the great advertising campaign of the crying Indian by the side of the road from the 70s. I mean, there's a hodgepodge of powerful imagery. Bambi's mom getting shot. You know, if you just, all kidding aside, you have three very different ideas about nature and different even industries. And then there's no person holding that together in the way that I think is really necessary. And time is really running out so fast that it won't, you know, I mean, it won't hurt, but.
But I think that there are very few artists working on the material that you're working on, and that perhaps if there were more and the image culture became more prevalent, it could have a communicative
Unfortunately,
and
so
powerful
many
effect.
like, you know, so-called nature artists are so lame that it's like a club I don't want to belong to.
Well,
I mean, I'm interested in the content, and I've just
cynical, Alexis.
Sorry, I'm not cynical. It's just like years of seeing these images come, and they just don't. They're not really effective. I mean, I'm skeptical. I'm open to. Believe me, I have plenty of hope, but I've seen so much stuff come into that arena and just die like a dog. Someone has to tell the truth, right?
Jim, can you imagine how a more elaborate image culture could help the eco-movement and eco-activism?
Versus dying like a dog? How does a dog die?
I don't know. I don't want to see it.
Well, see, I'm sitting trying to assimilate what Alexis is saying, and I realize and I would say this if he weren't in the room, he's in unusual company. There are not a lot of people doing what he's doing, right? And a lot of it's lame, you're right. So and it's one of the reasons I was so taken with this exhibit and these images, is that I think there is power here that in many cases, because we haven't actually seen a lot of this, or maybe because it hasn't been used or used effectively in telling a story of science, rather than, that is really a beautiful image. Look at the color of that frog, and just look at that backdrop. I mean, you know, you can't look at this and not be awestruck by how beautiful the painting is. And you know, I think you look at the Mount Rushmore painting and it's instantly jarring. And so I do honestly believe that there is a place for that sort of imagery in helping to tell not just the stories of natural history and an ecosystem and a plant here, but of what's happening in the whole planet.
Now, obviously, I agree with that because I wouldn't get up in the morning and do what I do. But I mean, in terms of a global, serious, like en masse thing that I believe we're talking about. I mean, I think that as culture, yeah, but culture, as we all know, is really a small part of, or the culture that we're talking about is a small part of what, you know, the Western world really privileges and considers. Alas.
Alas.
Okay, I have a question over here.
Not to be too cynical.
I'd like to ask, is that too loud? Pursue the imagery question. There's a delightful program on Nova last week, called The Illusion of Time, which perhaps you've seen. And what's wonderful about it is that there are no photographs of quantum theory, for example. And the physicist who hosts the show is using a lot of computer-generated images to try to demonstrate, to try to exhibit what it is he's talking about. And of course, the images the possibilities are almost limitless because he's using computer technology. And I wonder if that for you promises much more interesting things to do as a painter, Alexis, even though I know you only had a computer for a few years. And for the Jim the scientist, is computer-generated images useful for you in what you do as a teacher?
I don't understand that stuff, and I mean, I think it's beautiful, but I really have no sort of inherent connection to that type of imagery. I haven't seen that program, and I think they're beautiful. It's a type of psychedelia to me. I don't really understand that stuff.
I have to say that I guess in the fields in which I work, we don't use a lot of computer-generated images for the purposes of just generating an image. But I'm looking at Alyssa and wondering, thinking of, so what kind of image would you use to convey dark energy? Sorry? Take the microphone.
Sorry. My answer to the previous conversation was Al Gore, and my answer to this conversation is in astrophysics we often have this problem, some of which you're seeing in that show, and it's not true actually that computers can let you do more things than an artist can do, and it really relies on the creativity of the person using the computer and the understanding of the science for somebody to be able to make the kind of images that mean something to you. And so, you know, getting back to what Jim was saying about the students who we see who aren't necessarily as interested in art as we might like them to be, the tools that have been made are not usually made, the computer tools are not usually made by artists, okay, or in close consultation with very creative people or people who understand what they're going to be used for. And so they can do some things, and they're getting better and better, and things like animation and 3D perspective and whatever keep getting better. But really what's missing is the partnerships, like what you see here. And so the best we can do is not as well as we can sometimes do in our minds still. So it's good, but it's not that good.
So I think we have time for 2 last questions. We have 2 right over here.
Thanks. Alexis, I saw your show in DC. It's fabulous. So I have a question. A lot of your work seems to be about more collective stewardship, the impact of a lot of people on the planet. There's no people in your paintings, as opposed to somebody like Herzog who sort of investigates the individual and their impact on nature and vice versa. My question is, do you have any interest in portraying the actual scientists?
What do you mean?
Like Jim. The people
like
who will study the stuff that you are portraying in your work, or who are predicting the stuff that you're portraying in your work.
No, I'm really the player in my own work. You are. Yeah. But I want to go back to the last question about the computer is a fantastic tool and does amazing things. And some of the brightest minds are using computers to create things that are impossible to see with the human eye. And I love computers, and I think that, for instance, some of the most spectacular images have been in CGI created context. So in the computer games or feature movies or whatever, there's a lot of beautiful stuff that's that somehow survives the corporation that controls who's making them. And that's really something that is an interesting struggle. How do you sneak in interesting content in corporate America or globalism? But I want to defend computers. I think they're fascinating. On the other hand, I love what I do so much more than ever because I'm alone in a room with a 15th century technology, and that is an unbelievable privilege.
So we'll take the last question over here.
I was just wondering for Professor McCarthy, science is obviously based on a lot of experimentation and failure. And you mentioned the atmosphere of intolerance to kind of making incorrect statements and things like that, and how it kind of stifles scientific community. How has that atmosphere come about, and how do you think it affects our culture today?
I missed the very last part. How does that atmosphere
How has it come about, and how do you think it affects our culture, academic culture, scientific culture today?
Ooh, boy. Huh. You want to take that question? How does it come about? Well, I think it comes about in a variety of ways. First of all, science is about accurate description and well, Alexis said it earlier, being able to make an observation or conduct an experiment that generates data that are reproducible, and that another individual in the same situation, the same conditions, should be able to reproduce your results. And if that were not possible, then there wouldn't be this body of understanding that we call science. So I think we're trained as scientists to be meticulous, to understand what we're doing sufficiently well to be aware if something in the system could be tricking us. When data looks just too good to be real, it usually is too good to be real. To constantly question, to not jump to the conclusion that the data look like I thought they would, and so therefore I should accept them, and we'll all be happy. That's often leads you down a path that ends up with a troubled ending. So I don't think it's unrealistic for scientists to have these sort of behavioral safeguards that I mentioned earlier. I don't think it's necessarily reflects our culture. I think the expectation that the information provided by a scientist be reliable, I think is entirely reasonable, and particularly given that unlike the Agassiz and Humboldt and Darwin, who were a entirely different sort of scientific model. They had resources that allowed them to pursue a line of inquiry with no one looking over their shoulder, no one asking them to send in an annual report, no one telling them, unless you finish this book, Charles, in the next 6 months, don't count on any support to continue beyond that. So I think the notion today that first of all, a lot of the science is being done is very expensive. It's beyond the means of individuals other than extraordinarily wealthy people to themselves fund that work. So we depend upon foundations, we depend upon various granting agencies in the federal government to support work that is judged by our peers to be are worth the investment, worth, in the case of the federal government, the taxpayers' money to pursue this particular question. So I think the expectation that it be done in a way that is sufficiently meticulous and rigorous that the next person not find that, oh, well, that was interesting, but boy, I certainly can't reproduce it. That does happen, but when it does happen, it I think appropriately casts doubt on whether or not the individual that initially presented information that can't be reproduced now should continue to be should continue to have access to resources and freedoms to pursue further work in this area. I think it's a self-correcting mechanism. So I don't know that in any way that ties into any aspect of contemporary culture. I'm not sure that I was maybe following that part of your question, but I think that most people who are not scientists don't realize that scientists are trained to question everything they find, to ask whether or not it's really consistent with the world as we know it, to train our graduate students to question everything we tell them and to test everything we put forward as understanding to see if they can find fault with it. And it's one of the reasons that the sort of the body of knowledge that we call science, accretes over time, and we build upon that. If you couldn't be that reliable, if you couldn't be that confident that earlier information was reliable, then we wouldn't advance the science. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Thank you. Very interesting answer. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's been an enjoyable conversation. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Susan.
And thank you, Lisa, for hosting us here at the Museum of Science.